I would like to welcome everyone to what I believe to be is the fifth shiur on the section of Negative Theology in the Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam. I do believe this is the fifth shiur. If it turns out it's the sixth shiur, so every time I said fifth, just switch it to sixth. And if it is in fact the fifth shiur, then every time I said it might be the sixth, just switch it to fifth or delete. Okay, now, in the previous shiur, we were focusing on Perek Nun Dalet, chapter 54, in the Moreh Nevuchim, after the Rambam has established the fact that the only way we can talk about God is describe His acts in the world. Then the Rambam brings proof of this from verses of the Torah, and that's in Perek Nun Dalet, chapter 54. And in the Schwartz edition, it's located on page 130. Actually, today, I don't know whether it's today or this evening, since the day ends pretty early. So I actually brought along the Pinnis edition, and in the Pinnis edition, this is on page 123. Now, we took note of the fact. The Rambam's beautiful drashas, the beautiful way he learns the psukim at the very end of Parshas Kisisa, this incredible dialogue between Moshe Rabbeinu and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I think I may mention the fact. Now, when I say I think I may mention the fact, is due to two things. Number one is that this shiur is we haven't given shiur in several weeks because we took a break for Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. That's number one, and number two, I don't have a computer that I can, in fact, actually keep myself apace with the shiurim. But in any case, I made mention of the fact that the Rambam, of course, has two requests. Actually, he has three requests, but there are two basic questions he asks HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the three requests. The first request is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should pardon the Jewish people, should be Meichel Klal Yisrael for the Chet HaEgel, for the sin of the golden calf. And then he makes a request that he wishes to know, to be informed of God's ways. And God's ways is understood to be God's ethics, God's divine acts. And also, so that's the ethical request. And then Moshe Rabbeinu makes an ontological request. He wants to, in fact, actually be shown God's glory. And the Rambam interprets the request to be seen God's glory as Moshe Rabbeinu's request to know God's essence. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu makes two requests. One request is to know of God's ethical acts, to be informed of God's ethical acts, and the second request is to be informed of God's essence. Now, what's interesting is, and this I do believe that I made this point in the previous shiur, that Moshe Rabbeinu is in fact informed of God's ethical truth only after he asks the question, only after he requests to be informed of God's essence. In other words, when he asks to be informed of God's ethical acts, then God doesn't inform him of his ethical acts. He just pardons the Jewish people. But then after Moshe Rabbeinu says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ha'ini nas kvedecha, let me see your cover, your glory, which the Rambam interprets as being that Moshe Rabbeinu requested to see God's essence, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to him, on your ethical acts, right, I'll show you. Ani avir kol tuvi al panecha. That's the way the Rambam learns the psukim. I'm going to pass all my goodness in front of you. However, that what you request to see, to know my essence, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that you can't see. Now, for sure, the Rambam is deriving from this the fact that, and this is clear, this is not for sure. I mean, the Rambam says explicitly, we see over here, says the Rambam, that a person cannot possibly have any knowledge of God's essence, but he can only have knowledge of God through God's ethical acts. That in fact actually is what the Rambam says. But the fact that God answers, the request to be informed of his ethical acts only after the request is made to be informed of God's essence, we see clearly here in a certain sense, that there is a connection between what we're calling negative theology, man's inability to know God in any way, and, in other words, ethics. In other words, if in fact actually, Jewish ethics is in a certain sense predicated on the fact that one cannot know God's essence, but rather one can only know God's acts, and God's acts are the basis of his ethics. In other words, if in fact actually one would be an Ovid of an Azor, an idolater, then in fact actually one could know essence. In other words, basically God's ethical acts are ethical acts because God is removed from them. In other words, and not God himself. In other words, knowledge of God's ethical acts does not imply knowledge of God himself. So we see there's somehow a junction or a connection between the God's otherness from the world and knowledge of ethics. All right, this is, I think, we spoke about this connection in the last shiur. But I want to go a little bit further on this because there's a very important point in the Kutei which is important. Now, there's a very, very general discussion in philosophy. What is the relationship between ontology and ethics? Ontology is basically which informs us what is the nature of the world. If I ask a question, what is reality? What is truth? What is the truth of the world? I could either describe that truth through science, through any other means. That's what's called ontology. Ethics is what ought a person should do. And there's a veritable debate in the history of philosophy of the relationship between ontology and ethics. In other words, is it possible to glean ethical knowledge from factual knowledge of the world? And this is something that philosophers from time immemorial have argued on. It was actually, to use a yeshivish language, a machlokes between Aristotle and Plato. Plato postulated that just as the truth of the world contains not only physical facts, but actually ideas and concepts also constitute things in and of themselves which can be ascertained through man's intellect. So goodness was actually one of these things to be ascertained through man's good intellect, and therefore Plato believed that actually that there's an ontology and ethic. In other words, ethics is something that can be intellectually known to the world, just like any other scientific truth. On the other hand, though, Aristotle, right, the way many people understand Aristotle, those of you who are interested in this, you can see Putnam's small book and discussion called The Ethics Ontology Distinction. There, it's clear that Aristotle understood that ontology and ethics are things totally separate. In other words, that person cannot derive ethical actions from any factual knowledge of the world, but rather ethics somehow is generated by much more practical types of reasoning. That's clear in the Nicomachean Ethics. I don't want to go into the details. This is a bewusste dispute between Aristotle and Plato. The question is, and this is a very central question, not a central question in philosophy. In philosophy, this issue has been debated every generation. But the question is, where does the Rambam stand on this issue? And we'll see in a little while why this is a very, very important issue. In other words, does the Rambam subscribe to the Aristotelian distinction between ontology and ethics, in which case knowing something about the world does not tell me anything about the divine ethical content or purpose in nature, or on the contrary, can a person actually look at the world and actually recover God's ethics and perhaps even some of the mitzvahs, which was certainly the opinion of some Rishonim. Now, the opinion of most scholars, Maimonidean scholars, right, is that the Rambam recognized a distinction between ontology and ethics. Those of you interested in this, there's an entire scholarly corpus on this. A good article about this is an article by the Maimonidean scholar Marvin Fox, who I think I'll tell you what essay he wrote, but there was a collection of essays in which Marvin Fox claims, takes the standpoint that the Rambam actually recognized a clear distinction to ontology and ethics, in the Aristotelian tradition. And the Marvin Fox actually bases himself on what the Rambam says in chapter 2 of section 1, Perek Beis of Chelik Aleph. In the Schwartz edition, it appears on page 32 and goes from 32 to 35. To summarize, let me just summarize what the Rambam says in Perek Beis. In Perek Aleph, the Rambam, this is the very, very first chapter of the Moreh Nevuchim, there the Rambam says that when it says that man was created b'tzelem Elokim, it doesn't imply chas v'shalom that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a anthropomorphic image. has v'shalom. But rather what it means is that there's a similarity between man and God, that man, like God, is possessed of theoretical intellect. That's what the Rambam says, and that's the meaning that man was created Elohim means that man has an intellect which is in some way comparable to that of God's intellect. Now, those of you who are thinking to yourself, that seems to, in fact, contradict negative theology, this will be a discussion of at least 2 or 3 of my lectures at the very, very end, starting from chapter 68, 69. That's an entire, what I would call a sugya in the Rambam. But in any case, that's what the Rambam says in Perek Aleph, that in fact, actually, Tzelem Elokim refers to theoretical knowledge, man's seichel, man's intellect. Now, based upon that, he goes on to Perek Beis and asks a question, and raises a question that was asked by him by a certain educated person. I'm wondering who this educated person was. He says, that's true. So how do you explain the fact that God punishes man by eating from the tree of knowledge, the Eitz HaDas? Because when man eats from the Eitz HaDas, he's given das. Now, according to you, the Rambam, who claims that das, knowledge, intellect, represents the commonality between man and God, telling Elohim the highest level that a person can reach, because he's reached I won't say a divine level, but something which is analogous to a divine level. So how could it be that by disobeying God's word, by disobeying the God's injective to not to eat from the Eitz HaDas, then man is granted das, which is the highest level? And the Rambam explodes from this question. Obviously, the question was important enough that he actually made an entire chapter, a chapter in the Moreh Nevuchim. But the Rambam, after insulting the person a little bit, the insult is also very significant too. Says that that's true. The das we're speaking about is not, says the Rambam, is not theoretical knowledge. What's called das of tov and ra, knowledge of good and evil. Which the fact is that it includes many things. It could, it could include, opinions about, is this food good? Is it not good? Is this pretty? Not pretty? But it's mashmal within the Rambam too that also includes what you would call ethical knowledge, good and bad. In other words, it's called. It's what's called tov and ra. So in other words, the Rambam is the point of the Rambam is that as a result of eating from the Eitz HaDas, men who had previously been on the level of theoretical intellect now acquires what's called ethical intellect, ethical knowledge, which is certainly a yerida, a dissension from his previous position. Now, based upon this, Professor Fox wants to claim that we see clearly that the Rambam is clearly asserting a dichotomy between ontology and ethics. If in fact ethics is a part of ontology, why should the Chet of Eitz HaDas have represented a dissension or man's newly acquired ethical knowledge, any type of lack of perfection? Now the fact is that that this opinion of the Rambam can be supported by other parts of the Rambam too. The Rambam in many other places, which I'm not going to go into right now, but for example, much more spectacularly, at the very, very end of the Moreh Nevuchim, in chapter 54 of section 3, there the Rambam lists a hierarchy of perfections, and the Rambam lists what's called Rambam's about physical perfection and perfection of material material possessions. The world's becoming less perfect lately because of that. And then there's what's called, the Rambam calls ethical perfection, and ethical perfection ranks below what's called intellectual perfection. So there, it's clear that the Rambam is distinguishing between intellectual and ethical perfection, and ethical perfection certainly occupies a higher level than that of intellectual perfection. Process a higher level than that of ethical perfection. If you don't believe me, the Rambam says this in Perek Daled, and the page in Schwartz is 673. 600
in volume 2.
I'm sorry. Well, it's actually in second volume 3. It's the very end of the Moreh Nevuchim. Right, volume 2 of Schwartz. Right. But, no, I'll tell you, I think that the Schwartz edition is actually one hemshech. In other words, that was very smart of Professor Schwartz. Just because he printed another volume doesn't mean he started from page 1. He actually continued along that line, which I think was a very nice Einfall. I think only a one person could think of something like that. But anyway, I'm going to be right. Anyway, but in any case, In page 673, it's Schwartz's volume 2, but it's actually Rambam's volume 3. So, in other words, there is, and I think that most Maimonidean scholars actually concur that, the Rambam certainly, who is operating within the, in other words, within the, the Aristotelian conception recognizes this distinction. And the Rambam also mentioned several places that, ethics is basically a stepping stone to theoretical knowledge, etc., etc. However, there are opinions otherwise, right? There are opinions that there is an ontological and ethical distinction in the Rambam, that ethics can be derived from ontology too. A person who actually believed that was actually the famous Jewish philosopher in the 19th century, Hermann Cohen, the neo-Kantian philosopher that most of us know about through the writings of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik actually wrote his thesis in Berlin on Hermann Cohen. And Hermann Cohen wrote a very famous book called the Religion of Reason. And there, in, where is it? It's somewhere, whatever it is, I think in section 5. I actually think I put it down somewhere here. There in section 5, I think I actually, there in section 6, like it's section 6, 1 through 9, there's like subsections, 1 through 9, Hermann Cohen brings actually Raya for the fact that since our knowledge of God is of God's actions, and actually this is part of this parak, that it must be that there's ethical content in nature. In other words, there is a distinction between ontology and ethics. And the fact is that one of the people who actually agrees with Hermann Cohen that the Rambam understands that the association of ontology and ethics is actually Rabban Shal Kol Yisrael, Rabbi Soloveitchik. I want to quote from a famous essay of his, Ubikashta Misham. And there, this is the Triebitz translation of Bikashta Misham, which actually will appear as a footnote in the upcoming Mir Hashem, soon to be published, Meir Lectures on Genesis. And there, let me quote from Rabbi Soloveitchik from the Hebrew, Bikashta Misham, page 225. This is my translation. Rabbi Soloveitchik writes as follows, quote, "The philosophy of ethics, from ancient times until Kant, and from his time until today, has pondered the relationship between ethical law and natural law. In other words, it seeks the path from natural reality to the ethical spirit. Judaism declares the distinction between revelation and ontology." This is an incredible chap. Not only ethics, revelation, ontology is only a distinction in perspective. Ontological law expressed through the reality of creation reveals itself to man through ethical obligation. I mean, ptzatza, Bamba, Chiddush. The Rambam is actually, Rabbi Yeshaber is actually, promoting this identity between ontology and ethics. It's interesting. There's a article by Professor Aviezer Ravitsky that he wrote about this. He wrote an article about Rabbi Soloveitchik's essay of Kashta Misham, and he mentions in a footnote that he called up Rabbi Yeshaber and said to him, "How can you say that ontology and ethics are the same as the Rambam? Everybody argues on you." To which, this is what this is what Professor Ravitsky responds. Rabbi Soloveitchik says, "What can I do? That's what Hermann Cohen held." Tzarchi and Gadol. In any case, the fact is that in this parak Nun Dalet, it's quite clear that nature has none other than an ethical content. One can derive ethics from ontology, from understanding the truth of the natural world. And actually what the Rambam says, when a Kodesh Baruch Hu says, "I'm going to show you my ways," meaning my ethical ways, "Ani avikol tuvi al panecha," writes the Rambam, this is page 131. In fact, actually, since last time I actually quoted the Rambam from the Hebrew, since I brought the Pinus edition, so it says, when Moses asked for knowledge of the attributes and asked for this the nation, that's what he means when he show me, it says, he was told, "I will make all my goodness pass before thee." This dictum, all my goodness, I'm reading from the Pinus edition, page 124, alludes to the display of him of all existing things of which it is said, and God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very, very good. God will display to him, right, all existing things. He tziglefanov, Professor Schwartz, calling him son kulam. In other words, Kodesh Baruch Hu showed him the reality of everything. By the display, I mean that he will apprehend their nature. I'm reading from Pinus again. And the way they are mutually connected so that he will know how he governs them in general, he with a capital H, and in detail. Interesting. Moshe Rabbeinu was shown the reality of nature. And by being shown the reality of nature, that in fact Moshe Rabbeinu can now ascertain God's ethical acts, God's ethics. And goes on the Rambam to say, this is the Yud Gimel Midas. This is the Yud Gimel Midas. And the Rambam goes on and speaks about, for example, he says, it has become clear to you, and once again in chapter 54, page 125 in the Pinus edition, it has become clear to you that the ways and characteristics are identical. They are the actions proceeding from God, may he be exalted in reference to the world. Accordingly, whenever one of his actions is apprehended, H, capital H, the attribute from which this action proceeds is predicated of him, may be exalted, and name derived from that action is applied to him. For example, one apprehends the kindness of his governance and production of an embryo of living things, the bringing of various faculties to exist in them and in those who rear them after birth, faculties that preserve them from destruction and annihilation and protect them against harm and are useful to them in all their doings that are necessary to them. Now, actions of this kind proceed from us only after we feel a certain affection of mercy. Clearly, the Rambam is pushing what Hilary Putnam calls in his book, The Ontology and Ethics Distinction, high inflation ontological ethics, I think he calls it. In other words, ethics and ontology, one and the same. Now, the pella that I had with Rabbi Yoshe Bel, because I tell you that I, traditionally, when I teach Moreh Nevuchim, whatever traditionally means, right? When I teach Moreh Nevuchim, I understand that it could possibly be there's two dinner. This is what I always thought. There's two dinner. There's epis. In other words, like a general type of ethics. I call it post-ontological ethics, which the Rambam refers to at the end of chapter 54. Imitatio Dei, imitating God. But then there's ethics that come from mitzvahs, that you need revelation. So, and in fact, Rabbi Soloveitchik himself says in these soon-to-be-published lectures on Genesis that chas v'shalom, you can't do it. The Torah can teach us mitzvahs, but mitzvahs can only be done for revelation. That's apparently the Shittas Rambam. Almost speaks about how sinning only through revelation. However, Rabbi Soloveitchik says an incredible thing. Rabbi Soloveitchik says, and I looked at this twice. He says the distinction revelation ontology is only a distinction perspective. Gewalt, revelation coming from ontology. The fact is, what Rabbi Soloveitchik says is actually, right, not without basis. Because in the Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikrim, in the Yesod HaShvi, I'm reading from the translation of, who does the Arabic translation, a good translation, what's his name? The newer one. Shilat. Rabbi Shilat. The Rambam says that Moshe Rabbeinu achieved the highest level of knowledge of the physical world. And the Rambam relates this to the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, Peh Peh. It's an incredible thing. The Rambam says, the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm quoting from Yesod HaShvi, from Rabbi Shalat's translation, V'hu lahamin, to believe Shu Avim Shalachol Neviim, he's the father of all Neviim before and after, Hu Bechir Hashem, Moshe Rabbeinu is Bechir Hashem, Mikol Hamin HaNoishim, from the whole species of man, HaMasik B'milis Ala Yosef, was Masik from him more, Mashhisik V'yatzikol Adam, right? His Asaga was greater of anybody else. And then maybe it's a saga of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, but you can't be Masik a Kadosh Baruch Hu. I understand how saga Rambam is speaking about is really Moshe Rabbeinu's Chachma. That's what I understand. That's what I understand. He's masking more than the malachim. What are malachim? Malachim are intellects. And Moshe Rabbeinu's theoretical knowledge is the highest of all knowledge. That's what I understand in the Rambam. Which means Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah, which is the Chayra revelation, is actually rooted in the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu's chachma was on the highest level. And in fact, the Rambam, in section of nevuah, says, I'm not speaking about Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah. Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah is koyach hadibur. Only for koyach hadibur. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah, according to the Rambam, at the end of the section of nevuah, when he ranks the levels of neviah, says that Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecies, nevuah, doesn't come from the imaginative intellect, only from the theoretical intellect. So clearly, in other words, the Rambam is somehow making this connection between Moshe Rabbeinu's revelation and theoretical knowledge of the world, which is an incredible thing. I mean, in this Hakdama to Brachos of High Goyin says we can learn all the mitzvahs from the world through logic, but the Rambam is usually understood to be the Baal Plukta on that. If such a Goyin like that too, the Moreh Nevuchim generally could be a Baal Plukta on it. The Rambam says that since the war is only given to Chachamim, so therefore Klal Yisrael at Har Sinai could not have heard the Dibur of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, except for the first two Diburs, which could be understood intellectually. It's Mashma other mitzvahs cannot be understood intellectually. They couldn't be Masik. Why not? So, in other words, be that as it may, this section of the Rambam clearly establishes, at least, the fact that knowledge, at absolute, the highest level of knowledge of natural law in the physical world, is the means by which man can derive the ethics, the acts of God. In which case, that poses an incredible contradiction in the text of the Moreh Nevuchim. I mean, so once again, let's go back to Chetel de Barishan. Why is man's punishment das knowledge of good and evil? Good and evil comes only after theoretical knowledge. It comes from theoretical knowledge. Why is that a punishment? Now, so the fact is that like every dispute in understanding any text comes from the fact that there are passages which apparently contradict each other. Now, what I want to say is, I'm not actually, my intention now is not to go into a lecture, a shiur on Ontology and Ethics, because we're speaking about negative theology. But I'm going to actually explain to you why I feel that ethics is important in Rambam's negative theology. I already mentioned last year that, in other words, there's a relationship between ethics and negative theology. In the Rambam, in Hilchos Avodah Zarah, the Rambam says clearly that Avraham Avinu, trying to discover the fact that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu transcends the physical world, is not part of the physical world, but he also discovered the Kav HaTzedek, the Psukim of the Torah. So Avraham Avinu was Eisei Mishpat. Avraham Avinu's contribution was not only ontological, it was also ethical. There's clearly a connection between the two things. So, what does that mean by this? Now, from which I understood the following thing. The knowledge which Moshe Rabbeinu is ascertaining about the Bria, about the creation, about nature, is being shown to him by God. In other words, God, the Rambam says, Kol Tuvi, when it says, I will pass before you all my goodness. It rhymes it. I'm reading from the Schwartz edition, the third paragraph on page 131. It rhymes it. It's a remez, an illusion. Shehitzik lefanav, Kosh Baruch Hu presented to Moshe Rabbeinu, it's an imtsoyim kulam, everything that exists in the world, right? Like it says in the Pasuk, Vayayat Lokim is called She'osav V'nei Toivoid. Kosh Baruch Hu, right, presented to Moshe Rabbeinu all the facts of reality. Moshe Rabbeinu saw all the interconnected, right? Behitzik lefanav, Kavadasi, Shehitzik, Moshe Rabbeinu ascertained, as tivam, the nature of all things, viz kashrusum zebazeh, and their interconnectedness. Kashu yodes hanagosh lakeloisam. No, he understood God's science. Keitzel b'chlol b'prat, in general and in detail. And the base of this, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to ascertain, right, God's ethical acts. You give them midas. Entirely. Which means that, according to the Rambam, ethics comes, really, from Moshe Rabbeinu, ethics comes from a knowledge of the world. From a knowledge of the world. There was a big bit to speak about Moshe Rabbeinu at the time, but in other words, now. So, the fact is that once I come to an absolute theoretical knowledge, which is actually revealed to me by God, God reveals to me a theoretical knowledge of the world, then, right, I can come to ethical knowledge by imitating God. Now, what's interesting is, and this is what I wanted to say, is that at the end of Perek Nun Daled, when the Rambam makes a hierarchy, he speaks about ethical perfection. The translation of Professor Schwartz in page 673, the Schwartz edition is Malo to Ofi. It's like moral perfection. And then the Rambam says, Hamina Revi, the fourth type of perfection is intellectual perfection. And then the Rambam speaks about that after that, says the Rambam, there's something else, which is called, right? Haskell, right? The Rambam says, right? And he says, Chodiyana is Drachecha. Ve'edach alabanim tzachei, he quotes the same psukim in the Kisisa, and speaks about imitating God. Mahuachim of Ataracho, because the Gemara in Daf Yudalit. Which means, but this is, the Rambam says, the ethical perfection is a self-perfection. In other words, the ethical perfection I'm speaking about is a self-perfection which is a hechsher, a hachana, a prolegomena, a criterion, so that I'll be able to use it bein adam l'chaveroi. Says the Rambam, if a person lives on a desert island, you don't need this, we're not speaking about that, you don't need this perfection. Interesting. We're not speaking about an interpersonal, an interhuman ethical perfection. Speaking about a person himself being a Baal Musa. Which is a Raya Baal Musa can have bad midas too, because, if he's not with other people, can have bad midas, no enough kamina. The purpose of Musa have good midas to other people, not just to yourself. Anyway, but what's interesting is the ethical perfection that Rambam speaks about is, in other words, is intrapersonal perfection. The perfection of a person's midas, which is a necessary criterion for intellectual perfection, the Rambam says. But after that, the interesting is, imitating God is related, but in other words, how do I imitate God? God's acts of chesed are acts shown to other people. Which means, according to the Rambam, this is what I understand is, according to the Rambam, the ethics, which is below intellectual perfection, is like self-contained ethics. A person being ethical in and of himself, but not in relation to one other person. But the ethics, which requires knowledge of the world, ontological knowledge, is the basis by which a person achieves ethical perfection towards other people. So in other words, in the Rambam, there's two types of ethics. There's individual ethics, not related to other people. And then there's interpersonal ethics. Individual ethics is lower than ontology. It's lower than ontology. That's the chet of Eitzadas. Toivera. Person likes food, doesn't like food. Like food, doesn't like food. The Ram mentions nothing to do with other people. Unless you're a big tzaddik, you like food to please your, But I remember my oldest son, Uncle Moshe, once came to Yerushalayim. So he asked all the kids, like, what mitzvah did you? He lined up all the kids together. And Binyanei, whatever it is, what mitzvah did you do? So each kid's up, it's getting stuck, I made a bracha. My son said, my mother gave me soup, I didn't like the soup, but I ate it anyway. I think Moshe was mispiled for that. That's a raya, how personal ethics becomes actually. So in fact, the Rambam mentions in Perek Beis, in Chelik Aleph, taste, smells, colors, why? Beauty. That's intrapersonal ethics. That's below ontology. But B'nom l'chaveiro, interpersonal ethics, that's post-ontology. Ah, very, very good. Which means my relationship with man mirrors God's relationship with man. In other words, man acts ethically as God acts ethically. In other words, imitatio Dei. And that can only come with a knowledge of the natural world. That's, in my opinion, the proper issue, the proper resolution of this contradiction between ethics and ontology. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this for a very interesting reason. Batsim, what's the Rambam saying here? What's the Rambam saying here? The Rambam is saying the following thing. I think there's a very important thing over here too. Let's put these 2 points together. In other words, a person can claim to have absolute knowledge of the world. Right? The Rambam says, I can have absolute knowledge of the world. Moshe Rabbeinu was shown absolute knowledge of the world, but klal u'prat. Now, how can Moshe Rabbeinu be shown this? Only because there isn't God in the world. God has nothing to do with the world. In other words, the condition for being able to apprehend the world absolutely, right? Have absolute knowledge of the world. It's conditioned on the fact that this is not constitute knowledge of God himself. God is separate from the world. God can only show Moshe Rabbeinu absolute knowledge of the world if it's not part of God. So, but now, if in fact, though, man has absolute knowledge of the world, then man can, on the basis of this, have absolute knowledge of what? Of God's ethical acts. So, what is negative theology? Negative theology, in a certain sense, is a heichatimsum, using a Yiddish language, it ensures us that we can have absolute knowledge of the world and thereby ascertain ethical knowledge, God's ethical knowledge of God's acts. Without negative theology, we couldn't do that. Without negative theology, if God was in any way part of the world, then in fact, my knowledge of the world will be limited, my knowledge of God's acts will be limited, and therefore my ethical knowledge of God will be flawed. So it comes out that really, negative theology is not just the Rambam's meditations on God, but is really part and parcel of the Rambam's ethical philosophy. Negative theology ensures that I can peer into nature and try to learn from it divine ethical acts, which constitutes God's relationship with his bria, with his creation, and then from this I ascertain, by imitating God, man's relationship with other men. So, I want to claim that ultimately, this is going to be interesting, because the Rambam says later on in chapter 68, 69, at the very end of Negative Theology, the Rambam says there, just like man, God's intellect is his essence, to steer to Negative Theology, God's will is his essence, as I will explain later on. And Professor Schwartz references, and I agree with Professor Schwartz, is referring to the very end of the Moreh Nevuchim. What's God's will? God's will is the way God acts in nature. God's ethical acts. Otherwise, how do I ascertain God's will? So, in other words, by removing God from man's epistemological horizons, man is able to act like God with using man's intellect and apprehending God's ethics. So, in other words, what I want to say over here is that the function of negative theology is vital for serving as a basis for man's knowledge of God's ethics. Now, we'll get to Revelation another time, because Revelation. But I think this is really what the Rambam really wants to do. Now, why am I saying this down? It's not a drasha on chapter 54, because I think actually, as we go further, we'll see that the Rambam actually goes very deeper, goes much deeper. He says himself. I'm going to go deeper into the concept of negative theology. And he goes deeper and deeper. And all of a sudden, as he goes deeper and deeper, at the end he winds up by saying, but God has an essence. His intellect is an essence. His knowledge is essence. And his will is his essence. After you explain to me that on all depths of human conception, one cannot possibly know God's essence, how then can you turn around and declare what God's essence is? Unless somehow negative theology is the other side of the coin of man's informed ethical actions dictated on the basis of man's intellectual knowledge of the world. Okay? So, in other words, I want to claim that the chapter 54, the Rambam speaks about the derived of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and God's ethics, which are garnered from man's knowledge of the world, which shown to Moshe Rabbeinu, is has to be crucial in how the Rambam understands negative theology to be part of Judaism, which after all is actually, we're people of ethics. We're not people of philosophy. The Greeks are philosophers, we're ethicists. That's Yontav is Chanukah. We have to emphasize that a few times. Okay, fine. Now, the Rambam, actually, I want to mention here another interesting point over here too. It's very interesting that the Rambam doesn't speak at all about the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. In fact, the Rambam says in several places in Chelik Sheni, in the section of the Nevuah, he says several times, I'm not going to speak about the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. I'm not going to speak about it. Right? That's in Perek Lamed Beis. He begins the Nevuah and he says, for example, Perek Lamed Gimel, I'm not going to speak about Moshe Rabbeinu. He speaks a little bit of Har Sinai, this and that. But my intention is not to speak about Moshe Rabbeinu. At the very end of the section of Nevuah, he says Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah is B'koyach HaDibur, as opposed to Koyach HaDimyon. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah only involves the rational intellect and not the imaginative intellect. So let's speak about the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, I have a question. What's the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu? The Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, where's the Moreh Nevuchim? I mean, it's not going to speak about it. So how come Rambam doesn't speak about Moshe? He doesn't speak about Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe Nevuchim. He could possibly say he doesn't speak about the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moreh Nevuchim, because the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moreh Nevuchim is coming to tell me mitzvahs. Mitzvahs I learn where? Mitzvahs I learn in the Mishnah Torah, not in the Moreh Nevuchim. Although, that's funny though. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah doesn't occupy any part of my knowledge of God, my knowledge of man. I mean, the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim covers every philosophical topic of Judaism. How come it doesn't cover Moshe Rabbeinu? Now, the thing is, what I always understand is, when the Rambam says, I'm not going to speak about the Moshe Rabbeinu, what the Rambam really means is, Moshe Rabbeinu is not like other Nevi'im. Now, what does that mean? So there's like a Lumdisha thing here. Like, he's a Navi, is the pshat is that he's a Navi, but a different type of a Navi? Or the pshat is that he's not even a Navi. I call him a Navi because I have no better word, but he's not a Navi. I understand from the Yugim al-Ikrim, the fact that Rambam lists Nevuah and Moshe Rabbeinu as two separate things, and it goes on at length explaining the differences, then in fact Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah is totally not like it's not even Nevuah. It's called Nevuah because that's the term that's used. But the fact is that Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah has nothing to do with Nevuah of Nevi'im. Other Nevi'im, right? The Nevuah is a totally different type of Nevuah. It works totally differently. It belongs to a different philosophy. Now, what's interesting is, the Rambam says in Perek Nun Daled, that I quote it, when he speaks about ethical perfection, he says, Reiva mitzvahs, most mitzvahs, Einon ela kedei lahasik min zeh shleimus, are only coming to achieve this type of perfection. Most mitzvahs are coming to achieve what? Ethical perfection. Which means Nevi'im are coming to give people personal ethical perfection. Mashkichim. As the Rambam says in Zchak Nevuah, they're giving Mosar. Rambam says, Nevi'im like Moshe Rabbeinu and Moshe Rabbeinu give mitzvahs. Ein Novi Rosh L'Chadash B'Dava. Nevi'im are giving, Musa, Mashkiach. That's like mitzvahs. So it just means what? Mitzvahs are coming to what? Mitzvahs are in fact actually, that's what mitzvahs are coming to give ethical perfection. Right mitzvahs. Ain't an elakadei lahasig mitzvah shoshleim is called ethical perfection. Now, and interestingly enough is that we're talking about, according to the Rambam Perklim Daled, Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah apprehends a perfection that comes after intellectual perfection. Intellectual perfection. Moshe Rabbeinu's perfection comes intellectual perfection. So how can you come to the Goy mitzvah and elakadei lahasig mitzvah shleimus? So it seems to me that what we can say is that the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, according to the Rambam says that Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah is because he was masig more than any person could be masig. What do you masig more than masig? I want to claim that Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah comes, according to the Rambam, we have to say, comes from a knowledge of everything in the world. Meaning that what? Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah is rooted in ontological truth. However, you have to say that for most people, since people have not reached an intellectual level, so most people just coming to as a hechsher for ben Chaveroi. But the true meaning of mitzvahs, the tamim mitzvahs which are known to Moshe Rabbeinu, are coming, right, to achieve an absolute perfection, which is not ben Chaveroi, but the absolute relationship between man and God. Meaning, what I want to claim is that what the Rambam is really saying is that my ultimate relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu is ultimately ethical. In other words, the highest ethical relationship between man and God is achieved only after man, right, has garnered complete knowledge of the Bria, and Moshe Rabbeinu was able to achieve that. Which means the peh el peh of Moshe Rabbeinu is not knowledge of God, but is the ultimate ethical relationship between man and God that comes from an absolute knowledge of God's creation. So in other words, negative theology is really the basis for Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah, in which man, through knowledge of the world, achieves an ethical relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's really the purpose of the Torah, of Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah, which is the Torah, and that's how the Rambam concludes the Moreh Nevuchim at the very end of Cheder Gimel. Okay, we've said a lot here, and what I've done is I've laid actually a basis for the next classes, the next shiurim, because the Rambam is actually now going to take us on a very interesting course and path. The Rambam is going to go deeper and deeper. The Rambam is going to speak about that negative theology not only implies that God is beyond, unlike anything in the physical world, he's actually unlike anything in the conceptual and philosophical world. There's nothing that man can conceive of that has any bearing relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Where does that leave us? I claim that it leaves us with an ethical relationship. And that's what the Rambam is going to be developing in all these chapters. In other words, where human knowledge sees the horizons of its finitude, that's where ethics begins. And that's actually going to be the evolution of the Rambam's thinking in these chapters, right, beginning from chapter 55, 56, and coming to the final chapter, 69. We're going to actually trace the path of this evolution, Mir Hashem, and that'll be subject matter of the upcoming shiur. Okay? In any case, I want to bid farewell to my listeners. We'll miss them. Continue next time from an undisclosed location in Yerushalayim. Baruch Haba Tzlacha.